So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah. I work in programming with the Natural Areas Association, and I'm glad that you are able to join us for the live webinar today. Welcome. The Natural Areas Association is a member-supported nonprofit. We're over 40 years old, and we provide networking, training, and advocacy for natural areas professionals. We support your work in conservation and natural areas management by bringing you the latest science and best practices through our programming, which includes the Natural Areas Journal, a quarterly peer-reviewed publication, regional workshops, the annual Natural Areas Conference, and webinars like this one. I encourage you to visit naturalareas.org or connect with a colleague who is a member of NAA to learn more about how we support your work.
Hi, everybody. Good to have you with us today. I wanted to just say a little bit about this webinar today. It is a webinar that's made possible and free to you through the generous underwriting of our partners. The U.S. Forest Service has provided financial support for this specific webinar, and our partners at the Xerces Society are providing critical resource information to you as an in-kind contribution to the work that we do here at NAA. We're fortunate to be able to work with several partners who make webinars like this one today free of charge to you, but not all are underwritten. And so we'd like to encourage those of you who find this type of programming of value to become members of NAA. It's one of the ways that you can support us so that we're able to continue to offer this type of valuable resource for you. Times are changing, as we're all experiencing, and while we are determined here at NAA to continue to offer important information and support to our community, we're faced with the challenge of funding this work. Simply put, I think you'll see in the future, the near future, that a membership in NAA will bring with it even more benefit for those of you working in natural areas conservation. And thanks to those of you who are members, we look forward to continuing to serve you. And it's now my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Rich Hatfield. Rich is a senior conservation biologist with the Endangered Species Program at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. Rich manages all aspects of the Xerces Society's work on bumblebees. He has investigated native bee pollination in agricultural systems in the Central Valley of California and researched endangered butterflies in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado and throughout the Pacific Northwest. Thanks so much, Rich, for joining us today. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Lisa, and thanks for inviting me to be here today. It's really a joy, and I'm so glad that we have all these technological resources to do this kind of work during these times. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I know it's not easy to sit in front of a computer all day, but we're all doing it and finding new ways to learn. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in here. As Sarah said in the introduction, please go ahead and use the chat function to enter questions as we go along, and we'll have some time at the end where we can go back and forth and have some live question and answer, or at least live on my end with written questions from you all going through. So I'm going to talk today about conserving bumblebees in natural areas. I'll go a little bit through ecology because I think it's hard to conserve animals without knowing a little bit about their life history, which is an important aspect of conservation programs. And we'll then end with the best ways to conserve bumblebees the way that we know now, and some best management practices that I think are appropriate for natural areas. Lisa mentioned that I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We are a nonprofit. We're based in Portland, Oregon, although we have offices in, I think, 15 or 16 states now throughout the US. Largely, we work on, a lot of our work is based on native pollinators, so we're conserving bees and other pollinators, but we also have an endangered species program that works on all animals without a backbone: freshwater mussels, slugs, mussels, snails, all kinds of invertebrates that you can imagine. The joke in our office is we'll work on any animal without a backbone except a politician. I'm sure there was a huge burst of laughter there, which I can't get, but we'll just roll with it. But anyway, we also have a butterfly conservation program and then a pesticide program that, as you can imagine, will sort of overreaches and deals with all of those other programs. Like the Natural Areas Association, we are also a member-supported organization, and the work that we do is dependent on a membership base. And so if you enjoy what you see today and you're interested in invertebrate conservation, please go ahead and consider becoming a member of the Xerces Society. Today, we're going to focus pretty narrowly in on one aspect of invertebrate biology, which is pollination. And pollinators are what we call keystone species. Keystone species meaning that they contribute more to the environment than we might expect from just their size or their abundance. The reason that pollinators are keystone species is because 85% of the flowering plants in the world require an animal, and usually that animal is an insect, for pollination. There are 6 main groups of insect pollinators. In the upper left, we have butterflies. In the upper middle, flies. In the upper right, we have moths. In the lower left, we have wasps. In the lower middle, we have beetles. And in the lower right, we have bees. And bees are really the best pollinators of these 6. Most of these animals, when they're going to a plant, they're landing on a flower just to drink nectar. They're trying to get enough sugar water to get to the next plant or to find a mate. Bees, however, are actually collecting and intentionally eating pollen. So they're covering their bodies in pollen to bring pollen back to their nests. It's what they feed their young, and it's their only source of protein. And so because they're intentionally moving pollen through the landscape, they are really much better pollinators than all of those others who happen to be sort of incidental pollinators and might get some pollen and move them between flowers, but they're not intentionally moving pollen through the landscape. Bees are also important pollinators because they exhibit something called flower constancy. So every flower has different structural techniques. Every flower species has different structural mechanisms. And extracting the pollen from different flowers takes a certain level of skill. And once a bee learns how to effectively and efficiently extract pollen from a particular species of flower, it's going to return to that same species of flower again and again and again for that efficiency, so that it can reduce the amount of energy that it expends to get the pollen it needs to feed itself and its young. And that means that they're regularly moving pollen between flowers of the same species. And obviously, if you are a plant, you want your pollen to go to a plant of the same species, not of a different species. And because of that, bees are very good pollinators. They're also nest-based foragers. So when a bee has its nest, it returns to its nest every night. And so if you're interested in pollination services, providing nesting areas for bees ensures that you will have good pollination services. A lot of those other animals, moths and butterflies, once they emerge as winged adults, they're moving through the landscape. They're not actually nest-based. They might be in one area and then several miles down the road, or in the case of a monarch butterfly, several hundred miles down the road. And that also, if you're interested in pollination services, means that being nest-based makes bees really good pollinators. We care about pollinators normally because of ourselves. 1 out of 3 bites of food that we put into our body comes from plants that were pollinated by a bee. But bees and other pollinators are also feeding a majority of wildlife on the planet. Everything from songbirds to grizzly bears eat a majority plant-based diet. They're eating fruits, nuts, seeds, and roots. And we have all of those things because pollinators are there to help those plants reproduce. Without them, a lot of the wildlife on the planet wouldn't have the food that they need. So pollinators are feeding a majority of the planet, at least in some way. North of Mexico, we have around 3,600 different species of bees. And those make up many different life histories. It would be impossible for me to talk to you about all of those different life histories and different types of bees during this 40-minute webinar. But it's important for you to recognize that the majority of native bees in North America are solitary. They're basically single mothers trying to feed their kids. They live in a hole all by themselves, and they're flying around collecting pollen and coming back to an individual nest. They don't have workers, they don't make honey. They are very different than sort of what most people think of when they're considering a bee. And 2/3 of our native bees are nesting in the ground, and around 1/3 of them are above ground cavity nesting bees. They nest in like bark beetle holes and hollowed out twigs. Really quick, just a couple of pictures of what some of our native bees look like. I think one of the wonderful things about pollinator conservation is a lot of these beautiful animals are just living in our backyards. There's a wildlife safari out there just waiting for you in your backyard. Most people have just really never taken the time to look. This is a leafcutter bee bringing back a cut piece of leaf to help line the outside of its nest. We're going to be talking today about bumblebees, and this is an example of a bumblebee. And so we're really diving down within those 3,600 species. We're diving down to this narrow slice of bees that actually are social. Bumblebees do have a queen. They do have workers, although they don't make measurable amounts of honey. But they do contribute to the environment in unique ways, and we're going to talk about that and their conservation. So bumblebees have value in a lot of different ways. One of the main ways that they have value from our perspective at Xerces is they are the charismatic macrofauna of the invertebrate world. They really bring people in. If I was having a webinar today about sweat bee pollination or leafcutter pollination, the audience would probably be about half of what it is, if that much. I'm sure a lot of you do care about sweat bees and do care about leafcutter bees and mason bees, but the reality is that bumblebees are our charismatic macrofauna of the invertebrate world. They bring people in so that we can talk about these issues, and that in and of itself has conservation value. But in addition to that, bumblebees have unique ecological attributes that contribute to their ability to be important pollinators in the landscape. They have really unique physiology. They can essentially warm themselves up, which gives them the ability to fly in cold and wet conditions. So in areas that have cold, wet springs, bumblebees can be some of the only animals out doing pollination services. They're uniquely intelligent and have a really unique ability to learn. I'm going to show you a video in a second that will help illuminate that. And they also have incredibly long tongues. So flowers comes in all shapes and sizes, and the length of their tongue helps them access nectar in flowers with long corolla tubes. So plants that have long corolla tubes are sometimes dependent on bumblebees and other long-tongued bees for pollination services. And they're also innovative. Their ability to use their strength to their advantage allows them to do unique pollination. So this is a plant on the far right here called bottle gentian, and its corolla tube never opens up, but bumblebees have figured out how to pry that corolla tube open, crawl down and grab the pollen and nectar, and then move on to the next one. And other species of bees haven't figured that out. In addition to that, bumblebees do something called buzz pollination. And this is a little bit of a grainy GIF here, but what you're seeing is there's a bumblebee that's latched onto this flower and it's vibrating its wings at a particular frequency. And there are some species of flowers that have their pollen fused inside the anthers. And the only way to get it out is to vibrate it at a particular frequency. And bumblebees have figured out how to do that. And you can see this bumblebee is basically vibrating her wings and then covering her body in pollen, and she'll go somewhere else then and groom all of that pollen into these large pollen sacs on the sides of her legs. And honeybees and most other native bees can't do this buzz pollination, but around 10% of the plants on the planet benefit from buzz pollination, which makes bumblebees really important pollinators for a lot of those plants. And here is the video that I was talking about that will show you the unique ability of bumblebees to learn. So here researchers have trained bees how to move a ball. And so this researcher's training this bee that if it moves the ball to the center of that circle within that yellow circle, it will create a sugar reward. So what's happening is sugar water is actually coming up through the bottom And then the bee realizes that when it puts the ball in there, it gets that reward. And then after training, it can actually do this task really, really quickly. And then uniquely, one of the really cool things that we've learned is bumblebees can actually not only learn from a researcher, but they can learn just by watching their friends do it. So there's a bumblebee is watching its friend do a task, and it will learn to do the same task. And this is a level of learning that we've sort of previously associated with primates and dolphins and octopuses, but not invertebrates. And this bumblebee is doing calculus. It's realizing that it should choose the ball that's closest to the circle to expend the least amount of energy to get the most reward. So some really high level thinking and learning going on there in bumblebees for an animal that really doesn't even really have a brain, just a gathering of nerve cells in its head. So all of these factors make bumblebees really valuable for pollinating a lot of agricultural crops, including tomatoes and peppers and blueberries and cranberries and clover, squash, and melon. But they're also important because of buzz pollination to a lot of native plants, including shooting stars and pitcher plants and flax lilies and manzanita, and many other plants as well. But these are the ones that benefit from buzz pollination. So that's a real quick overview of why bumblebees are valuable. I'm now going to dive into bumblebee ecology in North America. And again, this is going to be a really quick overview so that we can get to some of the other things that we want to talk about in terms of their conservation. If you are interested in bumblebee ecology and other things, the Xerces Society has a YouTube channel with a bunch of webinars where you can go get more in-depth information about bumblebee ecology and a lot of other native bee and invertebrate ecology as well. So feel free to check those out. There are around 50 species of native bumblebees in North America. And if we look at the Williams et al. Book that came out in 2014, it shows this diversity chart. And we have the highest diversity of bumblebees in the mountainous western and coastal areas. So the Pacific Northwest and along the spine of the Rockies is where we find the highest biodiversity in North America, with a similar, somewhat of a hotspot in New England, and less diversity as you move further south. So bumblebees are generally cold weather specialists. The fact that they're covered in bees means that they thrive in colder climates. So our higher elevation and northern latitudes is where we find the most diversity. The largest diversity in the world is in the Himalaya, which is probably where bumblebees evolved from. So there are currently 47 described species of bumblebees in North America. Most of them are social colonies founded by a single queen. And different from honeybees in that colonies last only one season, so that the queen lasts for only 1 year, as opposed to in honeybees where the queen can live for 7 years or so. Nests can be quite small to quite large, and this is species dependent, but it's also environment dependent. So at higher elevations with shorter seasons, you're going to have smaller nests, even in the same species of bee. Their nests are often in abandoned rodent burrows or under thatched grasses, brush piles, unmowed areas. Basically, unkempt areas is where we find most bumblebee nests. But underground in tunnels and abandoned rodent burrows is where we find the most of them. The life cycle begins in the spring, and when the spring is really also species and location dependent. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a species or two that emerge in February, and that's spring. We have other species that don't emerge until June, and that's spring for them. So I say spring here, but it's really dependent on different species have different strategies in terms of when they emerge. But when the queen emerges from hibernation, she comes out and can spend a couple of weeks looking for a suitable nest site. And it's believed that competition for nest sites can be intense. But once she flies around, once she finds a place to actually build a nest, she will start provisioning that nest. And what that means is that she will build waxen pots, and she will fill waxen pots with pollen and nectar mixed together. And once she has filled that waxen pot up with pollen and nectar, she'll lay her eggs directly on that pollen and nectar in that waxen pot. And then the eggs will hatch, and the larvae, which look a little bit like worms, these are baby bees, will feed on that pollen and nectar, and she'll continue to feed them more and more as they complete it. And then once they've gone through their sufficient instars, they will pupate, just like a caterpillar to a butterfly. They go through complete metamorphosis. So a bee pupates and then emerges as a winged adult. And from egg to winged adult takes about 5 weeks. And this is an interesting time from a conservation perspective because the queen isn't leaving the nest much anymore. I often get a lot of phone calls in the early spring where people say, I was seeing bumblebees out and now they've disappeared. It's usually during this first interim period where there aren't any workers and the queen is spending a lot of time in the nest incubating her eggs, where we don't see as many bumblebees out and about. But then about 5 weeks later, the workers emerge and I stop getting those panicked phone calls about disappearing bumblebees. And then the colony builds up over the course of the summer. Again, there can be close to 500 or sometimes even more than that workers in a single nest. And then the nest switches to building or creating and developing the reproductive members of the colony. At that point, they start putting out new queens and males. And those new queens will go out on the landscape and find, they'll continue to forage and build up fat reserves. And also they'll try to find a mate and mate with that animal. And then they'll find a place to overwinter. So those newly mated queens will find a place to spend the winter that is separate from their nest. And we don't know a whole lot about hibernacula for many species. It's believed that leaf litter and loose bare ground near trees, particularly evergreen trees, seem to be important, but we really don't know a lot about this. And from a conservation perspective, this is a problem because this is where bumblebee queens spend half their life. And we can't have bumblebee populations without bumblebee queens. So we basically know almost nothing about half of the life cycle of the bumblebee queen for most species. So a lot is yet to be learned. So that's a really quick ecological and life history overview for bumblebees. I'm going to dive now into their status. So bumblebees, what do we know about their current status? A lot of what we know is based on these 4 species of bumblebee that are very, very closely related. So the Western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee were the first 2 species that were observed to be declining in the mid-1990s. A gentleman by the name of Dr. Robin Thorpe, who passed away last June, was doing research in California and Oregon, and these 2 species disappeared from his field sites. At that time, he sort of raised the red flag and across North America and said, hey, I'm seeing some declines in bumblebees. And sure enough, on the eastern United States, the rusty patch bumblebee, which is now listed as an endangered species, and the yellow-banded bumblebee seem to be going through parallel declines. Now, several years later, 25 years later, the rusty patch bumblebee is an endangered species. Franklin's bumblebee has been proposed for endangered species listing and will be added to the endangered species list later this year, I'm told. The Western bumblebee has been petitioned for endangered species listing, and a decision is due in 2023. And the yellow-banded bumblebee was also petitioned for endangered species status, and it was determined that it was not warranted to be listed as an endangered species. The rusty patch bumblebee is also protected in Canada, and the Western bumblebee also has protected status in British Columbia, I believe. From that information, the Xerces Society and a lot of other scientists formed the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Bumblebee Specialists Group. And this is a network of bumblebee specialists and experts that are working on extinction risk analyses for the native bumblebees of the world. I'm the Red List Authority for that group, which means I'm in charge of doing those assessments. And we have finished the assessments for the New World. So for North America, Mesoamerica, and South America, we have assessed the extinction risk of those native bumblebees. And these are what those assessments look like. We took a look at the historical distribution of these bees versus the current distribution of them. And as an example, this is Bombus occidentalis. We found that it lost about 40% of its range and a 75% drop in relative abundance. And this species is listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. There are some species that are doing just fine, like Bombus vosnesenskyii, the yellow-faced bumblebee. This is listed as least concern. And then an animal like the rusty-patched bumblebee, which had an average decline of nearly 70%, was listed as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. And all in all, when we finish these assessments, it's around a quarter of species in North America that are facing some degree of extinction risk, that are in one of these threatened categories. And so it's not just those 4 species that I talked about earlier. It's much more broad than that, although a lot of species do seem to be doing okay based on their historic condition. So why is it that bumblebees are declining? And perhaps more interestingly, why is it that some species are declining and other ones aren't? What are the threats out there in the landscape for bumblebees? And there's no single issue. Everyone always wants to know what, what's killing the bees or what's happening. The reality is that it's a complicated landscape out there. Bumblebees and other bees and members of the order Hymenoptera have really unique genetics, which make them uniquely susceptible to small population sizes, and that's playing a role. Pesticides are playing a role. Food supply is playing a role as we look at habitat loss, as is disease. And we're going to dive real briefly into all of these issues. So habitat loss is a major deal because we've taken a lot of landscapes that once looked like this, that provided flowering resources from early spring through late fall, and we've converted them to agricultural fields. And agricultural fields, while they sometimes provide flowering resources, they only flower for a couple of weeks. And I told you earlier that bumblebee life cycle really lasts from early spring till late fall. And so they need 12 weeks of bloom to feed their young and to complete their life cycle. So 2 weeks of bloom is not long enough to support bumblebee populations. Likewise, we're taking a lot of those agricultural areas and we're covering them in highly toxic insecticides. This is a GIF of the use of imidacloprid, which is a highly toxic neonicotinoid insecticide that is systemic. So when it's applied to a plant, it's actually absorbed by the plant and expressed in every tissue in the plant, including the pollen and nectar. So when a bee visits a plant that's been treated with a neonicotinoid, it gets a micro dose of that insecticide. And it may not be enough to kill it. It may be, and it is often much more likely to be what's called a sublethal dose, which then affects the bee's ability to forage and to interact with the world, which decreases its efficiency and therefore decreases its fecundity. And this is just cultural usage that you're seeing in these areas. So it doesn't include usage in natural areas or in urban areas. And sometimes, especially in urban areas, these chemicals are widely used. They're available at Home Depot and other places like that. So this is obviously a huge problem for bumblebees and other pollinators that are dependent on plants for their food. Climate change is also a major factor. It seems to be forcing bumblebees up into higher elevations, and likewise seems to be pushing bumblebees away from their range in the south. So bumblebees are losing their habitat in the south as the climate warms, but don't yet seem to have the capacity to move further northward to expand their range concordantly. So they seem to be stuck in what's called a climate vise. On top of all that, we have really started to spread diseases across North America through managed bees, including commercial bumblebees and honeybees. So by moving animals around North America, we have been spreading and amplifying diseases. And this has particularly been a problem with commercial bumblebees. In the mid-1990s, we discovered how to grow bumblebees in boxes and then ship those boxes to greenhouses where we grow a lot of peppers and tomatoes, because bumblebees are such great pollinators of those crops. But the problem is when you grow animals in laboratories in high densities, you get disease outbreaks and disease resistance in those laboratory animals. But then when you spread them out and ship them to greenhouses across North America, bumblebees are able to go in and out of these greenhouses pretty readily. And so wild bumblebees are interacting with these commercial bumblebees who are then spreading diseases to our wild bumblebees on flowers or through direct contact. And this, we believe, has led to the severe decline of the rusty patch bumblebee, of Franklin's bumblebee, of the western bumblebee, and potentially of the yellow-banded bumblebee, and probably some of their cuckoo bumblebee dependents as well. So this has had really dramatic impacts, and it's an unregulated industry in North America, with some exceptions in Oregon and California. So that's a real quick overview of the status and threats that bumblebees are facing. We're now going to dive and talk about conservation and management of these animals. So another quick poll question. True or false? We have the necessary baseline information to conserve bumblebees. So give you a few seconds to answer that question before we move on here.
So again, it looks like those numbers are starting to stabilize. So we'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Great. Great. So it looks like the majority of you got that question right, which is great. We actually don't have all the information that we need to conserve bumblebees. And this is true of a lot of our invertebrate populations. I'm having a little trouble advancing my slides here, Sarah. I'm going to keep trying. Okay, there we go. So we know so little about insect populations, but all of the evidence that's coming in right now suggests that a major amount and a major number of species are experiencing pretty dramatic declines. And there was a paper that came out in 2019 by Matt Forrester and some co-authors that suggested that even if we don't have enough information, the declines are so severe at this point that we have to start acting. We have to start moving and have to start providing actions, even if we don't know what the exact right thing to do is. So we're in that camp right now where we believe we need to start acting, even if we don't know what the perfect answer is at this point. Even so, we need to continue working on baseline data sets. If Robin Thorpe here hadn't been working on the western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee in California and Oregon, we might not know that bumblebees were in decline. So we need to do a better job keeping tabs on our populations. And as part of this, the Xeraceae Society has launched a number of Bumblebee Atlas projects throughout North America. We're running one in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho right now called the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas and the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas. And we've received funding in the last year to expand into Missouri and to California, which will be coming in 2021. And there are a number of other parallel efforts going on in the Eastern United States by several other groups. So Minnesota, Wisconsin, Vermont, Maine, New York, and Ohio also have similar projects that are ongoing. And these are helping us to establish baseline information, ecological use, host plant usage, because one of the dangerous things that we could run into, because some bumblebees are doing fine and other ones are in decline, we want to create habitat that supports those declining species. We don't just want to make the common bumblebees or the common pollinators more common. We need to create habitat that's supporting these rare species and helping to reverse their declines, not just helping to make common species more common. So we need to collect more information as we move forward. And this is just a slide that shows the effect that these targeted survey efforts can have. So on the left-hand side here, you can see this is the information that we gathered from 2014 to 2017 without a targeted effort. And then with a targeted effort, we're able to fill in all of these gaps where we had no prior information about which bumblebees are living there and what resources that they're using. So these are incredibly important conservation tasks to allow us to inventory animals. We also have, in those areas that don't have Atlas projects, we have a community science program called Bumblebee Watch, where you can take pictures of bumblebees and submit them and use our interactive identification guide, and then have an expert take a look at those photos. So please use Bumblebee Watch as a resource as well. It helps us gather that information that we need. In addition to that, we are helping land managers to manage land throughout North America. I wrote this book several years ago called Conserving Bumblebees that talks about how to manage land while thinking about the life cycle of the bumblebee that I talked with you before. It outlines threats, talks about management recommendations. It has plant recommendations that regionally, and has identification guides as well. But most importantly, managing land for bumblebees means putting 4 components on the landscape. We need to provide food for bumblebees. We need to provide shelter for bumblebees. We need to connect food and shelter to each other, as well as connecting those disparate pieces through the larger landscape to allow different populations of bumblebees to find each other. And then we need to reduce the effects of toxic pesticides on the landscape. So as we go through these in a little bit more detail, we need to look at food and put food on the landscape from early spring through late fall. And we have a number of different plant guides that are done regionally in our resource center. So Sarah, if you could maybe drop the link there in the chat of the resource center from Xerces, you can go there and choose your region. And there are plant lists there that are great for different times of year and different colors and all kinds of other resources. It's hard to do a national webinar and share what plants to grow because obviously it differs regionally. But most importantly, we need to have flowering trees and shrubs and wildflowers that are blooming from early spring through late fall. And just to call out 2 particular times of year, early spring is a critical time for bumblebee queens. They need to have enough food to start that nest. And the research that we have suggests that a lot of early pollen can really help springboard a colony to success. So those early blooming plants, and often that means trees, are incredibly important. Likewise, bumblebees need to build up enough fat reserves after they've mated at the very end of the year. So plants like goldenrod and other late blooming plants are really important to have on the landscape to help bumblebees find a mate and also build up the fat reserves that they need. So those are 2 critical times of year. As far as providing shelter, as I mentioned, they nest in old rodent holes, and having overgrown areas and brush piles and bunch grasses and bare ground are really important for fostering nesting and overwintering sites. And we need to learn more about overwintering, but providing access to loose bare ground and leaving leaf litter on the ground to allow bumblebees to find a place to overwinter is incredibly important. And it's also important to realize that these overwintering and nesting areas are often in very different locations than wildflowers. So just putting flowers on the landscape is not enough to conserve bumblebees. We also need to be providing these shelter areas. And then we need to work in the larger landscape to connect these areas together. So as part of that, we need to be creating habitat everywhere. It means creating habitat in natural areas, but also in farm fields and backyards and parks, and making sure that we're providing springboards and stepping stones for bumblebees to move through the landscape. We also really need to stop using highly toxic insecticides, especially in ornamental settings. They have no role in ornamental settings. There needs to be really clear economic thresholds for the use of these chemicals, and we really need to consider their usage and look for alternatives. Master gardeners and extension agents have cultural solutions for weeds and garden pests that are often excellent and worth looking towards. They require a little bit of education, but that's really important. The Xerces Society approach to pest management is to really examine the system. If you're having a pest problem, it isn't just because there's a pest problem. It likely means that something's lacking from your ecosystem. You're not providing the plants that support the predators that would help control that pest. And so keeping attuned to your system and providing all of the habitat components for that system is incredibly important for long-term maintenance and ecosystem health. Likewise with herbicides, these are great tools in your toolbox for getting rid of invasive plants, but we really want to make sure, especially with a lot of these invasive plants, have been supporting bumblebee populations for years. So we want to avoid confusion with native plants, especially native thistles, which are great bumblebee plants. And then we also want to just prevent invasions in the first place. Really trying to keep native plants on the landscape is incredibly important. But another important thing with getting rid of invasive plants is thinking about revegetation plans, because those non-native plants have been supporting bee populations. If you just all of a sudden remove them all at once, you're going to remove a food source that bumblebees have been dependent on. So what are you going to replace those invasive plants with? And trying to get those plants on the ground as early in the plan as possible is incredibly important. So that's sort of the overarching goal as we look towards best management practices for bumblebees. Mostly we want to create heterogeneity on the landscape. We want to create a diversity of landscapes, not manage all land the same in a single year. We want to create heterogeneity on the landscape, allow for adaptive management so that you can see how things are doing and then maybe change what you do from year to year. And then we also need to be sharing what we're doing with each other and close those knowledge gaps. So generally when we manage land, we recommend that no more than 1/3 of an area be treated in a given year, whether that be mowing or grazing or fire or herbicide treatment. Really 1/3 of the landscape, or 1/3 of the area that you're considering, it would be the maximum for a given year. That provides refuges and maintains food sources and nesting areas for bumblebees and other pollinators, as well as host plants for butterflies. With grazing, grazing's really an interesting piece. More grazing does seem to reduce pollinator and bumblebee diversity, but it also can be an important tool for maintaining, forage-dominated landscapes. Because of that, we recommend a max utilization rate of 40%. Move livestock frequently using rotational grazing or high density short duration or low animal units. And then limiting access to riparian areas and butterfly host plants. Generally, fall and winter grazing have fewer impacts. It's really important to monitor local conditions, think about drought, and what the native grazers need as well. With mowing is has incredible impacts, especially along roadsides. Those could be providing habitat for all kinds of pollinators. We have a series of mowing best management practice guidelines that are available on our website in that resource center, and really recommend that you take a look at those. These involve leaving unmowed areas, delay mowing till fall if you can, using the highest mower height practicable, and then mowing in the middle of the day when temperatures are warm. This will allow bees and butterflies to escape those blades and avoid the direct impacts. And then finally, it's important to recognize that honeybees, while they are important agricultural pollinators, they are not native in our ecosystem, and they are not important wildland pollinators. Our native bees are the important and essential wildland pollinators. They're the ones doing those pollination services. Beekeeping is a wonderful hobby, and it's obviously essential for agriculture, but it's not a conservation issue. Honeybees, it's not a native conservation issue. It's a kind of a farm conservation issue. And a lot of the issues are the same, but we do know that honeybees are competing with our native bees. They alter pollination networks by dominating the high value plants out there. And we know that they, just like commercial bumblebees, are transmitting diseases to native bees that could have long-term impacts. And so really considering if people are asking you if they can put their honeybees on your natural areas, really considering whether this agrees with your management goals is very, very important. And so we suggest avoiding honeybees in areas with sensitive bee populations, with the knowledge that honeybees can regularly fly up to 3 miles. Know that diverse wildflower areas are likely to have diverse native bee populations. We want to avoid competition with those native bees and avoid disrupting those pollination networks. Also, we want to make sure that there's sufficient infrastructure. If you're going to put huge amounts of honeybees on there, there needs to be enough roads to support that infrastructure. We've written a guideline, some guidelines about this called an overview of the potential impacts of honeybees to native bees, plant communities, and ecosystems and wild landscapes. And I think Sarah's going to drop a link there for you of that document if you're interested in diving a little deeper. And along that, I just want you to know that I know I've gone through some of this quite quickly, but we have a treasure trove of information on our website. If you go to xerices.org or the resource center that Sarah shared with you earlier, we have all kinds of plant lists and habitat installation guides and monitoring protocols and resources and fact sheets and books that can help you to manage these lands and make regionally appropriate decisions for that. And with that, I will say thank you very much. And I'm hoping that there's still enough time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Rich, for that presentation. That was great information that you shared with us. We do have several questions. Please keep those questions coming in, folks, while we spend the next 10 minutes on getting answers for you. So there have been several questions that have come up about the use of systemic insecticide, imidacloprid, and other neonicotinoids that are used to control invasive forest pests, particularly hemlock woolly adelgid and emerald ash borer. And one of our attendees points out that, especially in eastern hemlock, that's a conifer, so it doesn't flower. But some have argued that the systemic neonicotinoid could be taken up by flowering trees growing near hemlocks. And they're wondering if you have seen evidence of this having an impact on bees, Rich.
I don't have evidence of this specific treatment having an impact on bees, but we do know that these chemicals are water soluble, and so they are regularly moving through the water table, and they are certainly able to move fairly large distances from their original application site. So yes, nearby flowering trees or those spring forbs that might come up in the early spring, from a treatment, depending how that treatment was applied, if it was done via a sort of soil drench, it could certainly have impacts pretty far from its initial application. If the application was done through injection, I think some are done through bark injections, those are less likely to have sort of far-reaching impacts. And yes, I do think that these tools for land managers in particular, they're tools in the toolbox, and they can certainly be used, appropriately when there are economic thresholds and interests like people are mentioning. I think our concern is more when they're used prophylactically or they're just used broadly without necessarily a pest even being present. So certainly these are tools that can be used appropriately, but they really need to be done so in a targeted way and only done when there's an economic threshold that could be crossed, causing damage to a tree population or potentially a crop. And so anyway, that's my long diatribe or longer answer to what probably could have been a shorter answer.
No, that's great information. Thank you. Another question from Matthew. He's asking what actions land managers can take to target conservation on declining bumblebee species rather than more broadly helping species that may be more common. So specifically trying to address threats to threatened or endangered species.
Yeah, good questions. I think, we're still trying to do some research to help you make those management decisions. I think the best thing that you can do is to put a diversity of plants on the landscape. Just putting sort of the most attractive flower out there is great for common species, but making sure that there's a diversity of colors and shapes out there is incredibly important. There's also some fairly new research that's coming out. Some of it's been spearheaded by a gentleman by the name of Leif Richardson, who's at the University of Vermont. that suggests there are certain plant compounds that contribute to bumblebee defenses. And we sort of call these superfoods. They're plants that have caffeine in them and other interesting chemicals that help bees boost their immune system through sort of selective foraging. So it's been shown that bumblebees can selectively choose some of these unique compounds, and that helps them boost their immune system. And making sure that we're not just sort of putting the most attractive plants out there, but also some of these plants that have some of these unique compounds are incredibly important. And we've put some of these plant lists together for the rusty patch bumblebee, and I think we'll probably be doing that for the western bumblebee as well. If you're particularly interested in some of these compounds and some of this research that I'm talking about, please send me an email. It's rich@xerces.org. I'm happy to follow up with you and share the sort of emerging research that we have about some of these things. And then also, I think just thinking about, the fact that overwintering and nesting take place in areas that are separate from flowering resources, and thinking about management activities as well as providing just resources for overwintering and nesting. And especially as we learn more about those two things for individual species, it's going to be important to consider managing for those things as well. In other words, just putting flowers on the landscape isn't going to be the solution to all bumblebees.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Several other questions, looking for more guidance on the 1/3 role in terms of management. So you mentioned that management activities should be listed to 1/3 of an area during a given year. And we have folks just asking for clarification on that. For example, 1/3 of an acre may have a different impact than 1/3 of 1,000 acres, which may occur in larger managed natural areas. Is there a recommended maximum area for prescribed fire or other management action that impacts native bees?
No, it's really that it's more important, I think, to look at just leaving 2/3 of the area relatively undisturbed. That is the more important it's more of a ratio than it is a quantity. In that, if you're treating 1 acre, if you leave 2/3 of that acre untreated, you're going to provide a refuge for host plants for butterflies as well as nesting bumblebees and overwintering bumblebees. But the same would be true at a much larger scale, and trying to just scale those things back and not completely disturb the entire area that you're managing. And it's just a rough guide, but it's important to make sure we have some evidence from burning and grazing that suggests that leaving these refuges and having intact habitat nearby is incredibly important, no matter how much quantity that you're treating.
Great, thank you. From Molly, what direct, indirect effects, population and habitat, do large landscape wildfires have?
I think we're still learning about this, and I think the effects are really dependent on the type of fire. Some fires are burning very hot, and some of them are not burning quite so hot, and it depends on how sterilized the soil is after this and how deep the fire gets in terms of its impacts on nesting and overwintering bees. Certainly, some of these fires are certainly returning early cereal habitat to the ground, providing floral resources for bees, and these flushes of forbs that come up often after them can be really important. But again, hopefully some of these large fires are also naturally leaving skips and other areas as refuge for bees. But certainly some of the larger, really, really hot fires could eliminate, bumblebees from an area. But largely, bumblebees are pretty mobile animals. They're able to fly, several miles. And so I would imagine that especially once these spring flushes of wildflowers come up, they'll return to the landscape pretty quickly. I would imagine these large scale fires would have larger effects on, on skippers and other butterflies that just won't be able to recolonize as quickly if they're eliminated from the system from a hot, large-scale fire.
Okay. Could you talk more about prescribed burn timing and bee conservation? It seems that early dormant season fire, for example, immediately after first frost, would allow mated queens to find safe wintering sites without the concern of direct fire impacts to the queens.
Yeah, that's what we recommend, is trying to do managed fire after a first hard frost. That would ensure that most bumblebees would be in the ground hibernating at that point. So yeah, winter burns are highly recommended. It seems like some people in the West have been shifting towards spring burns, and we don't have a lot of evidence. But as a conservation biologist, I'm concerned about spring burns that would remove flowering resources from queens as they're trying to establish their nests. So yeah, late fall, early winter fires are best. Although I know that late fall gets more and more troubling as our fire season gets extended and it's harder to get permits to burn that time of year. So I know that there are some issues there, but that's the best time of year that we're aware of right now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Rich. Thank you for a great presentation, and thank you for addressing these questions. Rich will be able to see all the questions that were entered into chat today. I've also shared his email address and the Xerces links in the chat box, so please reference those. And I'd just like to thank everyone for attending. Thanks for joining us today. We're really happy that you're able to be with us and learn about bumblebees with us and how to manage natural areas for bumblebee conservation. We also would like to thank our partner, the U.S. Forest Service, who has provided support for today's webinar. So with that, I'll say thanks once again, Rich, for a great presentation. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.